Welcome to Co-Opinions. My name is Josh, and today I have Jake with me.
Hello.
So we are going into the second part of our Legacy of Zelda, but I just want to talk about a couple things that I've been playing recently. I beat, since we last talked, Nintendo HAL specifically released Bye Bye Box Boy. It's the third part of the Box Boy series, which is a very small puzzler on 3DS. It's a download-only game. You play as a little box boy who can make boxes. And that's the whole premise, and you solve puzzles with them. It's very straightforward. It's $5. It doesn't eat up a ton of time, and I loved it to death. I burned through it. It was arguably the easiest game out of any of them, but I still had a ton of fun. And my girlfriend and I finished through the A Boy and His Blob remake. I gotta say, it was nice, but I'm not gonna particularly miss it. The controls aren't the best. It's cute, but it doesn't ever really grab you in the way you want it to.
So it's just too much of a remake of a NES classic and not a reimagining?
Well, originally when it came out on the Wii, it was a decent reimagining. It's got gorgeous graphics. There's no denying that. But the controls are pretty spotty, and some of the gameplay requires the controls to be on point for you to be able to take advantage of it, and it's just not that robust. So it was a good game, but I'm not going to say that we're going to miss it a ton. Transitioning off that, though, we're going to get into the second part of our Zelda series, and this time we're going to talk about the Minish Cap, Four Swords, and Four Swords Adventures. Now, these games all have to do with the same antagonist, but they're kind of spread out along the official timeline. I know that Minish Cap is one of the earlier games in the timeline. Looking at it, it comes after Skyward Sword, it looks like, but before
Ocarina of Time.
Before Ocarina of Time. So officially, canonically, it's the second game right now, I believe?
Yes.
Okay. And Four Swords is... I think Four Swords is right after.
Yeah, Four Swords is right after it, and then Four Swords Adventure
is at the very end of the Majora's Mask timeline.
Yes.
Okay. And I always thought these games were interesting. We'll start with the Minish Cap, but what really jumped at me about these games was the fact that there was the same bad guy in all of them. Now, how they were released was Four Swords came out first, attached to Link to the Past for Game Boy Advance. After that, Minish Cap came out for Game Boy Advance, and that same year, Four Swords Adventures came out for GameCube. So we're not going to touch on them in the order they were released, because I don't think that speaks to the story or how the gameplay evolved well. So we're going to hit Minish Cap first. Minish Cap came out at the very tail end of the Game Boy Advance's life cycle. They actually considered postponing it because it was right when the DS came out, and they thought that the Minish Cap would cut into the sales of the DS.
In fact, because of that, it was released in Europe before it was released in the US, which is a very uncommon happening, especially with Nintendo games, because the Game Boy or the DS was not expected to release in Europe until later than in the US. It had a later release date in the EU. Mm-hmm. So they released Minish Cap there earlier than they did here in the US.
Like you said, that's something that was very uncommon. And Jake, this is a game you never played, correct? Because you did not own a Game Boy Advance.
Correct.
Now, this game got rave reviews, and due to circumstance, because it came out the same year as Four Swords Adventures, due to circumstance, I didn't actually play it until after Four Swords Adventures. So there were a lot of elements that were shared between the two that I didn't realize were shared elements at the time. For example, at the beginning of the game, you are going to meet with Zelda. There's a celebration involving, I believe, the Pickery Sword. And I know we've done a little research about this. I have played this game once 15 years ago. So my information's a little dated, but I'm relatively confident. And then you meet up with Vati. This is interesting because Vati was introduced in Four Swords that came out before Minish Cap, but he was a complete and total throwaway villain. Like, he had nothing interesting to him. He wasn't really all that special. In Four Swords, he was a floating black eye, essentially. no personality. Here he was a dude. Like, he talked. He had a personality. And he did not resemble the antagonist from Four Swords whatsoever.
So other than the name, you wouldn't have expected a connection between.
Mm-mm. And you come to find out, and I could be wrong on this, I apologize. I believe Vati is a Picori, you encounter them later. They're these race of really small people who made the Picori blade, I believe.
Right.
And Vati shows up to take the golden power from Zelda.
Right, and I believe technically the Picori call themselves the Minish.
Okay, and that leads into why you have the Minish Cap, because you find one of the Picori who have been turned into a hat, or he is the Minish Cap. Da-da-da. Anyways, this game, it had strong Zelda fundamentals. It went basically by the book. It did one thing really unique, and that was kinstones. Did you read up on these at all?
No.
So the idea was that you got these items that were half of a stone. So let's say you have a plate and you break it in half. This is half of the plate is your kinstone. That's what you find. The thing you have to do is go around and find other people with that half of a plate and join them together, and you make the world a little better with each kinstone you find.
Okay.
Now, sometimes it's incredibly minuscule, like you're just helping somebody with a really small thing. Other times, this was the most important one, you could teleport to a different area of the game. Let's say there's 4 areas of the game. When you're in the second or third area, you get the ability to teleport to the final one, the 4th area, and you have to save this old lady. She's being possessed by a ghost. And if you don't save her from the ghost, when you finally get there in the main game, she has died from her possession. And you can't fuse kinstones with her, and you miss out on a powerful item. It's not a crucial item, because if it was, they would have pulled some old school BS on you. But there were a ton of these kinstone fusions. The kinstone fusions, they had some fun little bits, like, and we'll get to this later, you could encounter Nairu and Din and Fayor or Furor. It's the incarnation of the 3 goddesses of power, wisdom, and courage.
Oh, okay.
You got to decide who got houses because of this kinstone fusion. It was an interesting little throwback because, as we will touch in a later segment, you actually interact with a version of those goddesses in a different game. So I found this to be really interesting because I absolutely love the games that they originally came from.
Now, one of the things that was interesting was because the game was actually, and I do remember the kinstones being a thing, so this plays into that. The EU version was released obviously before the US, but it was released before it was completely done.
You don't say.
It was buggy. And so there's one character where you can join kinstones with him, apparently more than one, and it's a required kinstone. And if you go to him and you go to join it and then you cancel out, it bugs out and you can never join kinstones with him again. Which, because he's a required character, you can't finish the game. It bugs out the game hard.
Now, there are a couple instances of this in Zelda games. It's not very frequent because Nintendo usually QAs their stuff like nobody's business. I know Skyward Sword had this, and we're not going to touch on 3D Zelda games whatsoever, but it's interesting because at least with the console games, even with the Wii ones, they could roll a patch out. But with the Game Boy Advance, you couldn't do anything like that.
Well, same thing with the old Super Nintendo and the GameCube and any of those. And part of the reason for that might be because this is not a Nintendo Zelda. This is a Capcom Zelda.
Okay, go ahead. Do you have more there?
Well, technically, I think Flagship. I know Flagship did the Oracle's games. I think they also did Minish Cap, but I'm not sure. It might just be straight Capcom, which was done as a second party with Nintendo at the time.
I was going to say, I will defend Capcom tremendously on this one because they also worked on the Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons games. I love those games.
Well, those are Flagship, which are a subsidiary of Capcom. I think Minish Cap, and let me check my notes real quick, was a direct Capcom. Yeah, Capcom developed. So one of two things has happened there. Either Capcom just took over the whole development of Zelda games for Nintendo at that point for portables, or they absorbed Flagship, and then Flagship was still, the people that were developers for Flagship were still in on it. But
makes sense. So it got good reviews. It wasn't generally people just hating on it, saying how terrible it was. They were generally a fan.
Right. Well, Capcom seems to have done very good with their iterations of Zelda games. I haven't heard really very many complaints about those. They're not like the poor 3DO Zeldas that we're not touching on.
We are not touching on those. Now, it's funny you mention that because I did watch a Let's Play of those somewhat recently. They're abysmal. I mean,
Yes.
they're jokingly
There's
bad.
a reason why they don't show up on the Hyrule Historia at all. They're considered non-existent.
They are the Super Mario Brothers movie of the Zelda franchise. Exactly.
Don't talk about that.
Back to the plot of this game, however. So once you go around and your goal is to put together the elements that will allow you to forge the Force Sword, which is supposed to be the thing that can defeat Vati.
Right, which is the Picari sword.
The Picori sword, after 2 elements, becomes the white sword, you said?
Yeah, I believe that's correct. I haven't verified that, but I believe I remember reading that. You get the first 2 and it becomes the white sword, and then when you get the other 4, the other 2, it becomes the Force Sword.
Right. Along the way, this was one of the things that jumped out at me as curious, was the 4 elements you get are the exact same looking 4 elements you will later get from Force Sword's Adventures. And I just thought that was a nifty little tie together. But as you get to the end of Minish Cap, at the very end of the game, an interesting thing happens. So you go to Hyrule Castle where Zelda's been kidnapped. There is kind of a time trial. So you have to go through a amount of rooms in a certain amount of time, otherwise Vati will drain the power from Zelda. I always got through it no problem. One of my buddies is like, oh, here, let me give that a shot. He played through it, and turns out that you can fail. I had no idea because he goes, oh my God, what's up? And I look over, and Vati goes, and done. All the power comes out of her, and she just kind of crumbles. Ooh! Wow. Oh no. But when you get there in the correct way, Vati transforms from his Picori form, and I did verify that he was Picori. He was actually the apprentice to your hat.
Yeah, to Ezio.
Yes, Eslo.
Oh, Eslo, sorry.
Eslo.
Yeah, and so he was the apprentice. To start at the beginning, when you're there looking at the Picori blade, the story is that the Picori forged the blade and gave it to a young boy because only children could see the Picori.
Mm-hmm.
It gave it to a young boy who had, if I remember correctly, a golden power. Basically, the Triforce mark on his hand, which we see in multiple other Zelda games.
It is calling it the Light Force, just for people who might be those guys. Just throwing that out there.
They talk about that being, something that happened way, way back in the past, probably in the era of Skyward Sword or similar time.
Right.
And then they use that to seal some stuff. And then Eslo's apprentice ended up becoming corrupted and trying to steal a hat from Eslo in order to, because the hat could give any wish.
Okay. Interesting power, but...
Right. And so Vati stole that basically so he could gain all power, and then turned Eslo into a hat, which was the hat that you wear, the Minish Cap, this little green hat with a bird on it.
And I know for a fact that, because I'm already talking about the end of the game, we glossed over a ton of characters,
right?
Because I know you go in this game all over the world. I know near the end of it, you go to the Sky World. It's actually a really interesting game, and I would suggest you don't have a Wii U.
I do not.
So it's available on the Virtual Console for the Wii U. It is a really good game. I really would recommend you play it, but I played it so long ago, and I am so stacked for time right now that I can't get back around to playing it. At the end of the game, here's what's crucial. You see Vati transform from his Picori form into this monstrous eyeball with these black orbs. He looks awesome. He looks super cool. But that's the form from Force Sword. So when you're not really drawing the lines, you see him turn into the monster that you've previously encountered, which I thought was super cool. Then you defeat him, save the world, da-da-da-da-da. Eslo gets turned back into a Picori from a hat, and then he gives Link a hat, and everybody lives happily ever after.
Gives him the hat specifically that grants a wish, and then he Or no, he gives it to Zelda, not to you. He gives it to Zelda. Zelda asks for everybody who's been affected by Vati's corruption or whatever, which basically turns the world back to where it was before the Hyrule Castle fell and all that stuff.
Now, I don't recall this. Does Vati get sealed away by the Force Sword at the end of the game?
If I remember correctly, he gets sealed into the Force Sword.
Okay, which makes perfect sense for the next game we're going to transition into.
Right.
So are we good with Minish Cap here?
I think that covers most of it, other than maybe talking about how the Picori are kind of based off of a couple different groups. There's 3 different types. There's the forest, I think the water, and the earth.
There's no Sky Picori?
Maybe it's Sky Picori. I don't remember what the 3 were.
Okay.
I do know that they're based off of the Ainu.
Ainu? What does that have to do with?
Well, no. That's a civilization. Let's see here.
I never actually heard this before.
They are actually a small race of people called the Koropogru.
Where is that from?
That's from the Ainu legends.
What is the Ainu?
You'd have to look it up. But they're basically tiny little people. They're tiny little people.
Okay.
Like the size of a thumb. And they're often depicted of carrying a leaf above them, kind of like an umbrella.
Like Totoro?
Kind of, but smaller.
Okay.
And they're pretty obvious that they probably took a lot of that from. The other, like I think the forest ones are kind of taken from brownies of Irish legend.
Okay.
Which are part of the Fae. Kind of little tricksters, and they like to come in and clean up but not be seen type of thing.
Makes sense.
And another thing that I found was apparently if in Breath of the Wild there was...
Hold up. Now, I have not played Breath of the Wild.
This doesn't matter because...
Okay. I'm about to say, I am religiously avoiding spoilers.
No, this is not a spoiler. Apparently, there were going to be similar characters in Breath of the Wild. However, they had such a breadth of characters already that they felt that adding them in kind of took away from that. So they pulled them from the game. But apparently they were expected to tie in more of the Minish Cap into the Zelda timeline in general.
Is there a place that they have definitively put Breath of the Wild on the timeline?
Not that I have found.
Okay. I don't want to dig too deep because, again, I'm trying to religiously avoid spoilers, and I would imagine that there are huge spoilers associated with
I will admit I've been avoiding it myself. I have obviously seen some stuff, but last time I checked, people were asking where it goes on the timeline, and as of a month ago, because I haven't been looking for it, there was no official stated spot on the timeline for it.
Okay, but we're getting off track.
Yes.
Back to the Minish Cap. So Vati gets sealed in the Force Sword, and we're good with Minish Cap.
Right, they basically take the Force Sword and they put it in a little
pedestal somewhere, right?
A pedestal where people can visit it on a specific day and say, hey, look, this thing saved our lives at one point.
Ta-da!
Okay.
Amazing. Yeah. We'll transition off of that to Force Swords, which I had to make the differentiation for Jake when we were researching this and discussing it, because he was saying, oh, we can put Force Swords in one. And I go, well, are we going to put it in the same episode as Force Swords Adventures? Is that a separate thing?
Right. I was really blown away that Force Swords and Force Swords Adventures were actually 2 separate games, although Force Swords in and of itself is hard to categorize as a separate game.
Force Swords originally was attached to Link to the Past when it was brought to Game Boy Advance. It was more of a side thing than necessarily a big, meaty game.
Right. It was kind of an add-on to Link to the Past for the Game Boy Advance.
Right.
To be a multiplayer side thing.
And when they released it and you could play it cooperatively, and it gave you some benefits if you played it. It carried back over to Link to the Past.
Right.
If you got enough medals and beat a certain thing, you could get a super awesome spin. But what I was going to...
And you also got a special temple in Link to the Past called Palace of the Four Sword.
Oh.
That apparently you could, after you beat it. But the biggest problem was in Four Sword, you had to have 4 players. You couldn't... you had to have at least 2.
Okay, I was about to say, I know you didn't have to have 4 because when I played through it, I played through it with Nick on the DSiWare because years later it was released for free.
Now the DSiWare version is modified. You only need 1.
Oh, is it?
Yes.
Okay.
But in the original Game Boy Advance one, they were really pushing the multiplayer thing.
Okay.
And so you have to have at least 2.
Now, Force Sword is very heavily gameplay focused. Force Sword focuses almost solely on the gameplay. It's a multiplayer dungeon crawler where there's puzzles that involve multiple people. You can get different items, and the idea sounds really cool.
And it's also kind of a randomized thing.
Was it randomized?
Either Four Swords or Four Swords Adventure. I'm pretty sure it was Four Swords. Where you had like 4 or 5 stages that you had to complete, and each stage there were 5 different stages available, and then it would randomize which one you would get in between them.
Interesting. So the thing about that was this almost procedural generation of how the dungeons were. They weren't strong dungeons. So I remember playing through it with Nick. We just felt like they were kind of hobbled together. It didn't really feel like there was thought put into it, which makes sense if these were semi-random. And the story behind it was at the beginning of the game, you find the Four Sword, you're dumb, so you take it out, Vati gets out, oh no, go defeat Vati. That is the whole plot of the game.
There was a specific reason, something about you touched the sword or something, and then he jumped out and then took Zelda as his bride. Basically kidnapped Zelda, and you're like, oh, I guess I need to take this and get him. And as soon as you touched it, it split you into 4 people. And 4 yous.
When it came out, I was either in early high school or middle school, and I really wanted this to be good, because the idea sounds awesome. Multiplayer Zelda? Tell me that doesn't sound amazing.
Right. Yeah, I can play Zelda with my friends.
Right. And the execution on this particular title, I felt was lacking. It didn't feel very strong. It felt like a proof of concept more than an actual game. However, so you go through the game, you beat the levels, you defeat Vati, you seal him back in the Four Sword. This is basically just a precursor, more than anything, to Four Swords Adventures. Now, is there anything else on Four Sword that you would like to mention before we transition off of it?
No, I think we pretty much covered the fact that it was more of an add-on to LTTP's re-release.
And what's important here was this was the first formal introduction of Vati.
In release timeline.
In release timeline, it was the first formal introduction of Vati.
Right.
So it was interesting to see the same year they released Minish Cap, where you get Vati's backstory. They also released Four Swords Adventures. Now, this game is criminally underrated, underrepresented.
And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it was called Four Swords Adventures, and they had released Four Swords as another game.
Well, and on top of that, did you do enough research to see the big draw of it?
Depends on what you consider a draw.
So what the big thing to me was the fact that this game heavily utilized the Game Boy Advance link cable.
Yes.
This was the best use of the Game Boy Advance
link
cable.
You see that as a big draw. I see that as a detriment.
Because you don't have friends. Sorry.
Go on. And yet here I sit.
Thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
So, no, it was because at the time I was broke, as you can get. And I had a GameCube by just the skin of my teeth.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't afford the game. Mm-hmm. I couldn't afford a Game Boy Advance. And I couldn't afford the Game Boy Advance link cable that was a separate accessory, let alone 4 Game Boy Advances and 4 separate copies of the game.
Well, wait, 4 separate copies of the game?
Yeah.
You didn't need 4 separate copies of the game.
Are you sure about that?
I played through almost the whole game with 3 other people. You needed...
Oh, I'm thinking of... Never mind. Yeah, okay.
You're thinking 4 Swords.
I am. Because you only had to have the Game Boy version in order to play... Or you only had to have the GameCube version to play it on the handhelds.
Yes, on the Game Boy Advance.
And to be fair, the idea behind it is really cool.
Oh, the idea behind it was amazing. So, to anybody unfamiliar with it, what you would do is you could use your Game Boy Advance as a controller. There was a cord that hooked from your GameCube into your Game Boy Advance. I can think of less than 10 games on the GameCube that actually utilized this functionality.
If that.
It was not many. What you did in this was you controlled your player character, your Link, 1 of 4. You could be green, blue,
red, and purple.
Yeah, red and fuchsia.
Purple.
Yeah. Anytime you would go into a screen that wasn't the standard screen, like if you went into a building, went into a cave, went into a different dimension.
Anytime you went off of the screen from the rest of the group.
You went into your Game Boy.
Yeah.
And the execution was so cool because you could see people looking up and looking down as the audio would have just cut out there because I actually turned my head down like some kind of mouth breather to explain that. You would see people looking up at the screen, and then if a bomb was about to go off, everybody would look down because they all had to run into a building. It was really awesome to watch, and there was a degree of a competitive element because the goal was to, when you collected 2,000 force gems, you didn't have rupees in this game because there was no shop. There were force gems. And when you collected a total of 2,000 between everybody, you had a stronger sword. And at the end of the level, there was bragging rights. Who got the most force gems, right. You won the level.
You had to compete for force gems.
You didn't have to compete. There was no benefit to competing, but you could. And
a top score is always a reason, Josh. You know that.
Yeah, well, I've been on leaderboards before. The mighty fall real fast. But it looks like, because honest to God, I don't remember most of the story of this game. What I remember is about halfway through the game, you find out Ganon's going to be an issue. And this is why I check out of the plot, because it looks like, for some reason, Shadow Link was trying to break the seal on Vati's Force Sword. I don't know why, but he successfully does that and lets Vati out. I would imagine it has something to do with Ganon.
Yeah, so I forget what created the Shadow Link. It does tell you.
Dark Mirror. So he stole the Dark Mirror and used it to create Shadow Link and sent him to kidnap the Shrine Maidens, which would then let Vati out, which I guess was a smoke screen. Oh, and trick Link into releasing
pulling the
Vati.
Force Sword and therefore releasing Vati. And once he was done, you were basically like, once he was out, you were basically like, well, guess I've got to take up the Force Sword and do something about this.
Right. So, anyways, we glossed over that real fast. The point of it was this game executed the multiplayer Zelda tremendously well. Like, the puzzles were so good, and the graphics were really lush pixel graphics. It was rendered really well. I'm not going to say it had a good story because I believe it was collect the 4 elements so that way you can stop Vati. Right. And then after you collect the 4 elements, you find out, oh, there's actually a trident we're supposed to stop somebody from getting. It's Ganon's trident. Oh, Ganon's trident's gone. Oh, Ganon's actually out. Well, did we ever actually stop Vati? We did not. We did not. So it's funny. Near the end of the game, they're like, go stop Ganon. Oh, by the way, stop Vati. He happens to be on the way. So, luck. The gameplay was really, really good. And it bums me out to no end. We have not seen a multiplayer Zelda game nearly as strong as that. We'll talk in a few episodes about Triforce Heroes, which will get a passing mention at best because I played through that game with both Brent and Nick, and that was at the very least, a disappointing game. I was really hoping for a 4 Swords level game because this game progressed like I imagine a Zelda game with multiplayer would. Each world was broken up into levels, which is not your typical Zelda. There's not an overworld. Right. You progress linearly along. However, the levels are all laid out like you're progressing through a Zelda game. It's really impressive. You have an objective. It's to get to this end point. Along the way, you have to try and collect an element from one of the fallen knights of Hyrule because Ganon killed all of them because they were the only thing that could keep him from the Dark World or something. The plot is really secondary here. The gameplay is so amazing. And I know that a handful of my friends, I'm trying to think if Brent was one of them. We played through this game. It was so much fun. The way I actually originally played it was one of my buddies from when not to sound douchey about this, but I spent a year in Germany because of my family. And when I came back to America, a friend from over there was visiting. He's like, hey, I picked up this new Zelda game. New Zelda game? I love Zelda games. I'm like, what is this? And we started playing it. I'm like, oh, wow, this is awesome. So I ended up buying it because of that.
And on top of that, it's one of 3 games for my favorite console of all time.
Mm-hmm.
The GameCube is and will always be near and dear to my heart. It's such a shame that it was criminally underrated. And the thing is I bought one close to launch. I still have it. It's still run.
Oh, yeah. Those things were made to last.
And yet, every PlayStation 2 I've ever had has quit working. I know there are people who are like, oh no, I still have my first PlayStation 2 and it runs fine, but they've had class action lawsuits. And then don't even get me started on the Xbox, the original Xbox. In my mind, GameCube is the most superior console of its generation.
That there are people who would call them fighting words, but
yep, I know.
Nah. I've owned all of them since whenever.
I'll tell them what. We can fight with our consoles, and whichever one manages to continue work afterwards wins.
I feel like, and I could be mixing this up with like a CSI show, but I feel like somebody wants to beat somebody else to death with a GameCube. I really feel like I might be mixing this up with an episode of CSI, though. So disregard that. So the gameplay in this was really fantastic. It's a real bummer to me that we haven't seen anything else, because this game, chronologically, time-wise, takes place at the end of the child timeline on the official, the one where you defeat Ganon and Link goes back in time. There's a kid timeline and an adult timeline.
So the Ocarina of Time's kid timeline.
Yes. So after that, I believe it goes Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, and Four Swords Adventures down the line. What's really curious about that to me chronologically is that it's acknowledging that Vati was a bad guy before the split, and it chose to bring him back with... There's no way they actually gave that thought at the time, and they're going to be hard-pressed to put anything after that in that particular timeline, assuming they want to stick to an adherence of the timeline. Because according to this, at the end of the game, they sealed Ganon in the Four Sword. It seems like an interesting decision. Why don't they just kill him? Why does he not die more often? Like, how many of these
Because
games...
then you can't reuse him in later games and make more money.
But you can. Because in Skyward Sword, and I won't mow this grass too much because Brent's real gung-ho to talk about the 3D Zelda games, but we put a pin in that because we want to beat Skyward Sword first. Anyways, at the end, sorry.
Breath of the Wild.
Breath of the Wild. Sorry. Anyways, at the end of Skyward Sword, you find out the Proto-Ganon, the reason Ganon keeps coming back is he's like, my hate will burn forever. So...
even if you kill him, he still... comes back in a fashion.
Skyward Sword was supposed to try and address... I'm not going to get into this because we'll touch on it later. There's a reason he keeps coming back. And while I love the gameplay of Four Swords Adventures, high and low, I mean, just truly loved it to death. They really dropped the ball in bringing that. I don't even know how they could do it nowadays. Yeah. So the closest they could do is if the handheld had a way of communicating with the main system, like the 3DS was supposed to communicate with the Wii or the Wii U or something, and that never materialized in any capacity. Then if the Wii U...
And to be fair, both the PS Portable and the Vita, both were supposed to interface with the PS3 and PS4, and there were games that did it, but...
marginal at best.
Who remembers any of them? Yes, I know there's going to be someone who's going to respond, but...
there was a racing game.
Yeah, I still don't care.
Yeah, no, I don't blame you. But I'm not holding it against Nintendo. But this was the best multiplayer effort that they had put forward for Zelda. And I am going to rip Triforce Heroes to shreds when we get to it. But they've just never done anything similar. The Wii U could have potentially done it had it supported multiple gamepads, but it did so abysmally that... sales-wise, it had a very strong library of first-party titles, and I believe there were some second-party, but almost all of my Wii U library is first-party. And the Switch, I guess you could do it with the local multiplayer, I guess, because it's got that portable thing going on. But you'll never have that same look up, look down, look, I need to quit doing that. You'll never have that same approach with the current hardware they have. I don't know how they're going to replicate. They're probably not going to replicate it. And this is my earnest disappointment with the fact that of these 3 2D Zelda games, Four Swords Adventures was undeniably my favorite. It was super fun. If they found a way to bring that to current generations, I would probably go out and rebuy it. But I don't know how we could do it with the current limitations. Like, how could you do that on a system now?
I don't see it being on a first-party mobile system like a 3DS or anything. I'd see them at best trying to find some way to use these guys right here.
Oh yeah, these guys right here is mobile phones because a lot of people aren't watching the stream. Nintendo has talked about how they want to do more of these mobile efforts. That's actually a really interesting point to tie in the mobile effort into a console effort. So that might be a possibility. That's not actually a bad idea.
But then you have to set up ways for them to communicate to each other. And how do you do that? Do you do it over the internet? Do you do it via a local Wi-Fi link?
My guess would be the local Wi-Fi link, because I believe, and I could be wrong on this, I believe the Switch, your local multiplayer has to be over Wi-Fi. Right. But I could be wrong. I don't own a Switch yet. But I will. I will very soon. Stoked.
So you need to seek professional help, I think.
Yeah, I do. From the Nintendo helpline. Call today. Anyways, so I don't think we have a whole lot left with this particular bunch. We knew that this segment would be shorter, but where were we going to fit any of these other games in?
Yeah, they're kind of a weird timeline offshoot of everything else. They don't really tie in much to anything else.
Mm-hmm. But the first game that we discussed, Minish Cap, that is a great game. If you have the opportunity, go out and try to play it. Four Swords, you can probably pass. Not to be too particularly spiteful, but it doesn't do a lot for the formula. And
it might be worth playing Link to the Past a second time, third, 8th, 9th, 100th time.
There's always,
just to get that extra palace.
There's always a good reason to play Link to the Past.
Yes.
So, yeah, we did touch on that in the last episode. But what you really should do is if you can somehow find 4 Game Boy Advances, 4 Link cables, a GameCube, and this game, play Four Swords Adventures. That is the multiplayer Zelda game that Nintendo, I have never seen them hit the mark better for that format. Now, mind you, there are 3 examples, 3.5 if you talk about Wind Waker, which we'll get into that a little bit when we talk about...
But that's a completely
different episode. But I think that it's a good time to go ahead and call it on this one. What do you say? You have any other thoughts?
Nope. Other than if you really need a reason to buy a GameCube, there are plenty out there, so...
You can extol the virtues of your system later, I promise. Okay, well, until next time, Jake, thank you very much for coming on.
You're welcome.
And until next time, this is Co-Opinions.